Hello, everyone. Welcome. Tonight, we have a story about humanity's oldest and deadliest enemy, disease. It's called Contagious. Stick around to the end to get a behind the scenes insight into the story. As always, please like and subscribe if you enjoy the video. But for now, let's get into it. Rural Iowa. "You're sick too, John," Mary whined at her teenage brother as he lay in bed, his forehead damp with sweat. He tugged at the covers bunched up around his waist. "I am cold," John moaned. Mary shook her head and rolled her eyes. Seemed like John was always sick, and she wasn't sure how much of it was just him trying to get out of work. Nevertheless, she grabbed the covers, straightened them out, and laid them over her brother. "I wish Mom was here," he continued. A lump rose in Mary's throat. Their mother had died just 2 weeks ago from a similar ailment, and she hadn't had time to deal with her death as she had quickly inherited her responsibilities. Even though she was only 14, she was the oldest girl, and now she was cooking and cleaning for 6 people, including herself, which left her tired and with little free time. "I have to go check on Emma. Here's some soup for lunch. I'll see if we can get some medicine soon. Dad's asking his employer for a loan and maybe a few other people for help. Anyway, just hang in there." Mary pushed her dirty blonde hair out of her sweaty face and set the bowl down on her brother's nightstand. She patted his leg and left, but heard him slurping the soup behind her. She paused in the doorway and leaned against the frame. She didn't want to be sick, but she wished she could spend all day in bed. She softly closed the door and went to check on her youngest sister, Emma. At the entrance to Emma's room, she knocked lightly and, hearing nothing, silently let herself in. Emma, at 4 years old, was Mary's joy. She loved the way everything was exciting for her, from seeing the chickens lay eggs in the hen house to watching popcorn pop on the oven. She found herself thinking, "What I would give to see the world through your eyes." She tiptoed up to Emma's bed, ready to tickle her if she was feeling a little better and to get her to laugh. She gazed down at Emma's face. Some curly blonde hair had fallen across her eyes, and when she moved to push it back, she noticed her forehead was much cooler than it had been for the past few days. Her fever must have broken. She clasped her hands together and jumped in excitement. She wouldn't have to spend the little money they had getting medicine for her, and she couldn't wait to get Emma back in the kitchen with her. Emma loved helping, and often did help by making her enjoy the job. Mary bent down and traced Emma's face from her forehead to her cheek. She had been sleeping almost 4 hours, even though she had gotten a full night's sleep. She had woken up only for a spoonful of oatmeal and went right back to bed. Mary bunched her eyebrows together and squatted by her little sister's bed. That's when she noticed her lips and face were pretty pale. "Emma," she whispered in a sing-song voice. She shook her slightly. "Let's get up and have some soup." She pushed on her arm, but she didn't move. She placed her face right above Emma's mouth and nose, but she already knew she wouldn't feel her breath. Suddenly, Mary didn't want to touch her. She sat down by her bed, and as Emma's fate sunk in, she thought of all the amazing things she'd never get to show her. Mary bunched her face together and balled Emma's blankets in her hands. Then Mary pushed her face deep into the bed and circled her arms around her face so she could scream without anyone hearing her. "This isn't fair," she thought. She lifted her face from the bed. Her mind flashed to when she asked her father for money to get Emma medicine, and he had told her they barely had enough money to keep the house, and that Emma would get better soon anyway. She just had a cold. "She didn't get better, did she?" she wanted to yell in his face. In Mary's grief, a rage bubbled inside her. At her father for not taking Emma's illness seriously, especially when her mother had just died of a similar disease, and at the rich people who relied on her parents' work but paid them as little as they could get away with. Kneeling at Emma's bedside, Mary alternated between the tears of burning anger and the halting weeping of loss, until breathless and exhausted. Then, with her last bit of strength, she wiped her face, stood up, and went to tell her other siblings and father. It was only later that Mary realized everything was her fault. The day after Emma's death, Mary started early in the morning, as the activity and sense of purpose distracted her from facing the reality of the situation. She found the list of houses that had employed her mother as a cleaning lady when she was alive. Her mother had diligently scrubbed each of these houses and provided them with 2 healthy meals a week. This quality of work meant her services were in great demand all over the neighborhood. Mary felt certain that at least one of these wealthy former employers would give her a loan in exchange for her own cleaning services so she could provide Emma a decent funeral. As she approached the first house, she put on a happy face and knocked. A woman opened the door, and while Mary made sure to keep her smile, she said, "Hi, I'm Sandra's daughter. She cleaned your house before she did. She used to clean your house, and now that she's not here, would you want to hire me? She taught me how to clean." The woman gazed over Mary's head and down the block, almost everywhere but at Mary. Then the woman stepped back into her house and said, "We don't need those kinds of services right now." She began to shut the door, and Mary shouted, "Could you give me a loan, please? We need it for—" But before Mary could utter another word, the woman had closed the door. Mary stood there, mouth open, with her right hand half raised to knock again. She shook her head, restored her smile, and knocked again. No response. Her smile melted, and she turned that hand into a tight fist and gritted her teeth. "That woman didn't even listen to me," she complained to herself and kicked at the woman's flowers, but they just swayed and stood back up. Mary stomped down the driveway back to the sidewalk. At the next house, she didn't bother with a smile. She knocked hard at the door, 3 quick blows. She stood, scowling in the doorway, tears brimming her eyes. This time a man answered. She began, "Mr. Brown? I'm Mary, Sandra's daughter. Emma just died, and—" But that was all she could get out before her wave of tears crashed, and she broke down to cry. Even as her shoulders shook through her tears, she cursed herself. She didn't even get out the part about needing a loan. Standing in the doorway, Mr. Brown said, "Don't cry. Emma was your sister? She's in a much better place now. Go off and be with your family." He made pushing gestures for her to go without actually touching her. Through her tears, Mary said, "No, we need money." "I don't think you should be thinking about that at a time like this. Go home." Then he rapidly retreated into his house. Dazed, she walked a few feet from the man's house, sniffling, crying, and wiping her nose, while trying hard not to make eye contact with anyone who passed her. After her tears finished, Mary kept going and visiting her mother's former employers, trying to get a loan, making sure never to let herself break down like that in front of any of them. She would visit 8 more houses that day, only to be turned away 8 more times. Inside, Mary felt a growing resentment taking the place of her grief. In the evening, once the sun set, Mary pushed open her ground floor bedroom window and stepped out onto the grass. The cold brought a crisp, clean smell to the air, and she shivered and grinned as she thought about her plan. As she went, she scanned the deserted roads for anyone who could catch her and headed over to the home of the First Lady, who rejected her. As she passed each house, biting her nails the whole time, she remained alert for any sign of police. After just 15 minutes, she arrived. She sauntered up to the woman's carefully arranged flower bed, roses, tulips, and other flowers Mary didn't recognize. Mary squatted down, and with her eyes on the house, she ripped the flowers up by the roots and left them where they lay. When every flower was picked, she ran back home, keeping a hand over her lips to hold in her laughter. 2 days later, Mary stared dully at the urn about the height and width of 4 large carrots, where her sister's body supposedly was now. Neither her nor her father had managed to find anyone to loan them money for a casket, so cremation it was. Her father had let her choose the urn, so she picked a bright pink one with balloons on it. She lifted it now and set it next to the one that held her mother, and Mary had the brief thought that she was starting a morbid collection. Per usual in their household, Mary had cooked for the funeral. She made a fruit platter and was currently sitting at the table picking up raspberries, licking the juice off her fingers, and going back for more. One of the neighborhood kids was eating off the same plate with her, and with juice running over her face, it reminded Mary so much of Emma that she wanted to cry. Specifically, she remembered how she had done almost this exact same activity with Emma and John days before Emma's illness had set in. 5 days later, Emma caught wind that this neighborhood girl had died of the same illness her Emma and mother had, and goosebumps broke out all over Mary's skin. It was like her subconscious was trying to tell her something that she didn't want to understand. Mary decided to conduct an experiment. She made 10 fruit plates for all her mother's former employees that had rejected her request for a loan. For 5 of them, she licked her fingers as she arranged the fruit. For the other 5, she took extra special care not to touch the berries, and even went so far as to wear gloves. Then she went around the neighborhood and delivered them one by one to each of them, with the excuse that she had extra produce and wanted to show off her culinary skills in the hopes of receiving a job. After that, Mary returned home and attempted to distract herself with her endless housework. Days went by, and she waited to hear if any of her neighbors were sick with that disease. Finally, her brother John, who had recovered in the meantime, told her that 3 of the 5 houses where she had licked the fruit had sick people. "What about the other places where Mom used to work? Is anyone sick there?" she asked, grabbing John's hand. John pulled his hand out of her grip and stepped back. "No, I don't know. I don't think so. What do you care?" John replied, looking at her sideways as he poured himself a glass of water. Mary didn't reply. She stepped out into the backyard where her family grew fruit trees. She stared at her hands as if they didn't belong to her. "Can I make people sick by choice?" she wondered. Then her next thought crashed into her like a train. Did I kill Emma? And my mother? Mary fell to the ground and lay there with her cheek pressed against the grass. Her grief passed after some time, and slowly, a smile crept across her face. No one knew she had this power. She pushed herself up from the ground and began to make fruit platters for the other 5 families that had rejected her pleas for help. I hope you enjoyed the story. Some of you may have been listening to this and thinking, this sounds a little bit like Typhoid Mary. Well, congratulations. This story was inspired by her. For those of you who don't know, Typhoid Mary could infect people with typhoid while she was just a carrier, which meant that she didn't display any symptoms of the illness. After knowing this, you might be wondering, is this her origin story? It's not. This story is completely fiction. That's all for today. See you in the next one.